In 1877, the nation was in the fourth year of a depression that had seen the economy shrink by a third. When pay cuts by 4 of the nation's largest railroads went into effect that July, workers in Martinsburg, West Virginia walked off their jobs at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, vowing to shut down the rail yards until their wages were restored. When local police failed to get the trains running, President Hayes sent federal troops to protect the railroad and end the insurrection. But it didn't end. The walkout spread nationwide. Striking workers brought the city of Chicago to a standstill.
We're striking not for a few cents, but for principles. And the spirit of liberty, equality, and fraternity so actuates us that we will stay on strike till the last one of our brothers on the other roads receive their rightful pay.
The Great Railroad Strike lasted 2 weeks. When it was over, 100 people had died, millions of dollars in property had been destroyed, and the nation had been put on notice that something was terribly wrong. It was the first national strike in U.S. history, and the first time that the federal government had sent troops to end an internal labor dispute. In the following decades, the nation would be struck by wave after wave of industrial conflicts. Americans watched with alarm as businesses shut down, bombs exploded, and troops fired on citizens. To many, it seemed like the nation was moving towards another civil war. Industrialization was transforming the nation, creating a small Anglo-American business elite with unprecedented wealth and power, a thriving middle class, and an even more rapidly expanding class of industrial wage earners, more and more of whom were newcomers to U.S. shores. Although the standard of living for U.S. industrial workers was better than that of European workers, the gap between rich and poor was growing wider and wider. Before the Civil War, the United States had been a nation of farmers.
As of 1875, most people are working in very small workplaces. Most Americans would be working on farms. Even in large cities, which had emerged by this time, most people would be working in small workshops.
By 1900, 2/3 of all workers labored for wages. People who used to work for themselves were now being treated like cheap, interchangeable parts in the nation's vast industrial machine. Although wages held steady with prices, most working-class families couldn't survive on the income of a single wage earner. To make ends meet, women and children joined the industrial workforce in huge numbers. Many women worked as factory operatives, especially in the garment and textile industries. They labored under terrible conditions, putting in long hours for a fraction of the wages men received. As an experienced female tailor explained,
I have worked from dawn to sunset, not stopping to get one mouthful of food for 25 cents.
Employers insisted that women themselves drove down wages by flooding the market with their labor. In the late 19th century, 1 out of every 5 children under the age of 16 worked.
Many children were forced to work because of the economy. Their families would have suffered even greater poverty if they did not go ahead and work.
Children would go into mines and into factories at a very young age. It was not unusual to see 10-year-olds in factories and in mines. This was a life where children grew up with very little education and very little time to play and really even be children.
The United States industrial economy paid scant attention to worker health or safety.
Machines were open, pulley belts, wheels, rapidly spinning machinery of all kinds. It wasn't unusual for women to have their hair caught in pulley belts and literally be scalped. Men often had their hands disfigured. In places like Pittsburgh, you could almost tell a man's job by his disfigurement.
In the railroad industry alone, more than 200,000 workers were killed in accidents between 1890 and 1917, more than in any United States foreign war except World War II. In anthracite coal mines, where over 90% of workers were immigrants, 3 miners died every 2 days. Roofs collapsed on workers, toxic gases choked them, or raging fires trapped them underneath the earth.
And if you lost a finger or a hand in an industrial accident and couldn't work any longer, then that wasn't thought to be the responsibility of anyone but yourself. So you couldn't get workingmen's compensation. There wouldn't be anyone to take care of you other than your family. And if a father died in an industrial accident, in a mine explosion, let's say, then the woman and the children would be left to their own devices.
There were no child labor laws. There was no occupational safety and health laws. There was very little protection for workers, young, middle-aged, or old, in terms of protecting them from what employers wanted to do, which was to maximize their profit.
As late as 1913, 25,000 workers were killed on the job, and 750,000 were seriously injured. So how did businessmen justify these conditions? Success, they said, came to those who earned it. In the U.S., land of opportunity, anyone could rise from rags to riches. All it took was hard work, determination, and a little good fortune, or luck and pluck, as author Horatio Alger said.
Very few people rose. If they rose, it was a small rise. But this leap from utter poverty to being the president of a corporation is pure myth. When you look at who became presidents of large-scale corporations, with very few exceptions, these are people who started wealthy in life.
Businessmen argued, and conservative Americans argued, that the reason that some businesses grew larger is because they were the fittest, not because they had special advantages, not because government may have favored them, not because some of them may have achieved their success through corruption and other means, but because they were the best.
American workers and farmers came up with their own vision of the nation, quite different from that of the wealthy industrialists. In the decades following the Civil War, business and labor would fight a brutal battle for the very soul of the United States.
The reasons why they would go out on strike had to do with the fact that they were working, but they weren't making enough money to pay for the things they needed in order to live. They couldn't pay their rent sometimes. They couldn't pay for enough food to eat. They couldn't pay for clothing for their families. And so eventually they would get to the point where they would decide to unite with each other and demand from whoever their boss was for the boss to give them more money.
In the 1880s, American workers joined the Knights of Labor, a labor union first organized in 1869 by a group of Philadelphia tailors. The Knights of Labor took off after the election of Terence Powderly as Grand Master Workman in 1879.
They wanted workers to be better paid. They wanted workers to work shorter hours in better working conditions. But they were also concerned about a larger issue about what's happening to this republic.
The Knights of Labor called for new laws to restrict child and women's labor, to inspect the nation's workplaces, and to recognize women's suffrage.
About 10 to 15% of the membership by the middle of the 1880s consisted of women, and an equal percentage, 10 to 15%, most people think, included blacks. So it was the most democratic movement to its time.
In the early 1880s, the Knights won a series of strikes. Its members engaged in a wave of boycotts, refusing to buy anything made by a company that would not negotiate with the union. Attracting new members by its successes, the Knights of Labor became the largest union in United States history. Boasting 700,000 workers in 1,500 locales, the Knights prepared a great national campaign to win workers an 8-hour workday.
The year 1886 will be known as the year of the great uprising of labor. The skilled, unskilled, the high-paid, and the low-paid all joined hands. George McNeil, Massachusetts Knight.
In the spring of 1886, close to 340,000 American workers went out on strike, demanding an 8-hour day. By the end of the year, more than 1,500 strikes and boycotts had paralyzed the nation. Their employers struck back.
There were private guards who were hired by these businessmen to see that the plants did not have union sympathizers in it, to see that during strikes the pickets were kind of beaten back from the walls of the factories so that the factories could operate with non-union, so-called scab labor. And they also used their political power. They would go to local either mayors or they would go to local governors and sometimes to the President of the United States and ask them to call out the militia or the U.S. Army to quell disorders and get those workers back to work.
In May of 1886, the war between capital and labor again exploded in flames in Chicago, the industrial colossus of the Midwest, where 40,000 workers struck for the 8-hour day. When pickets and strikebreakers clashed outside the great McCormick Harvester Company, the nation's largest manufacturer of farm machinery, police attacked the strikers, killing 4 workers. The next day, a crowd of 2,000 working men gathered at Haymarket to hear speeches denouncing the police brutality at a rally organized by German-speaking anarchists, people who opposed any kind of government. The rallies seemed to be diminishing at that time, but someone threw a bomb into the ranks of the policemen. One officer was killed. The police fired on the crowd, killing 10 and injuring 50. The police arrested 8 anarchists, 4 of whom were quickly convicted of the crime, despite the fact that no evidence was ever found to tie them to the bomb thrower. But few Chicagoans complained. The Haymarket bombing whipped the city and the nation into an anti-labor, anti-immigrant frenzy. Growing numbers of Americans blamed foreign agitators for the United States labor crisis. A single bomb, wrote labor organizer Samuel Gompers, had demolished the 8-hour movement.
The Haymarket affair became a tragedy in a sense, not just because of the men who were killed in the affair, but also for the workers themselves, because workers were frightened to be attached to such a radical movement.
The Haymarket riots destroyed the Knights of Labor, but out of its ashes, a new union arose. Samuel Gompers, head of the Cigar Makers International Union, had found what he believed was a better way to form a labor union. Building its membership on skilled workers, the AFL excluded political radicals, African Americans, and women. Asked what labor wanted, Gompers replied with a single word: more. More money, that is. The first major test of the AFL's new brand of white and male trade unionism soon came against none other than the powerful Andrew Carnegie. In 1889, workers affiliated with the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers Union struck against Carnegie's Homestead Steel Mill and won wages a third higher than those at neighboring mills. Outraged at this assault on absolute control of the Homestead mills, Carnegie vowed to destroy the union. Sailing for a vacation in Scotland, he left associate Henry Clay Frick the job of busting the union. In June 1892, Frick announced that the company would negotiate only with individual workers and not the union. The war was on.
Workers were locked out of the Steel Corporation. They were not allowed to get in so that they could strike within the company. And when the workers tried to storm the company plant, the Pinkertons would repel them. So they would use direct force with a private police force.
Strikers and their families fought off armed Pinkerton agents in a severe battle on the shores of the Monongahela River. When sympathy strikes spread to surrounding mills, Frick convinced the governor to send the state militia to keep the mills open. The workers held out for 4 long months, but outgunned and overpowered, they finally gave up. The failure of skilled steel workers to protect their jobs dealt a severe blow to the AFL. Out west, company-hired goons and state militias crushed mine workers in a series of even more violent confrontations. Trouble was also brewing in the American countryside, where people were mounting their own campaign against America's new industrial order. Soon after Cleveland took office, the nation entered into the worst depression in U.S. history.
There was a depression that developed. Prices again had been very low. Many workers were laid off. As wages were cut, workers began to see that they again were not going to be able to pay their rent and to pay for food.
By 1894, 150 railroad companies had collapsed and dragged 16,000 firms and hundreds of banks down with them. In New York City, more than 20,000 homeless sought shelter in city jails. In Chicago, police stood guard at the train station to prevent tramps from entering the city. Nationwide, millions of families stood on the verge of starvation. Private relief efforts did not come close to meeting the needs of the unemployed. With no aid forthcoming from business or government, workers erupted in protest. 1894 alone witnessed more than 1,300 strikes involving more than 500,000 workers.
The most famous demonstration of that depression was Joseph Coxey's army. Joseph Coxey decided to protest these conditions and to try to get the federal government to provide some relief to all the unemployed. And he just started marching from the West Coast, and he began gathering people around him as he marched from city to city who became part of Coxey's army. And they did march on Washington and petitioned, not successfully, for government relief for the unemployed.
When Coxey finally arrived in Washington that May, rumors of revolution swept through the city. Coxey was immediately thrown into jail, and his followers dispersed. Meanwhile, trouble was brewing back in Chicago at the Pullman Palace Car Company.
These people who built the Pullman cars were highly skilled workers. They lived in company town where the houses were built by the company. And when the Depression came along, the company had cut wages, but had not cut the rents for the houses.
When workers met with him to complain, Pullman fired them. So they struck, asking help from the American Railway Union.
When the Pullman workers went out on strike, they called for the other workers in the American Railway Union to go out on strike, and eventually a major national railway strike developed. It became one of the most important conflicts of the late 19th century because it involved all of the leadership of this new union, the American Railway Union, and Eugene Debs, who was the president of that union. As the workers tried to prevent the railroads from moving, the companies would attach mail carrying cars to the Pullman cars, and if you didn't agree to carry a mail car, you were obstructing the United States mails, so that went to court.
The arrival of federal troops in Chicago on July 4th triggered a riot which left 13 dead and 50 wounded. 7 days later, more than 34 people had died. What had begun as a boycott of Pullman had become, in Eugene Debs's words, a contest between the producing classes and the money power of the country. With business, courts, and federal troops allied against them, the strike collapsed.
The leadership of the strike was arrested, and the strike was essentially defeated.
The events of 1894 demonstrated just how deep the conflict between capital and labor had grown. They also convinced growing numbers of farmers and workers that to change things for the better, they would have to join together, farmer and worker. Change would come through the ballot box and not the picket line. In the presidential election of 1896, voters had the opportunity for the first time in decades to choose between two very different visions of the United States.
After a long life of toil, economy, and self-denial, I find myself and my family paupers. With hundreds of hogs, scores of good horses, and a farm that rewarded the toil of our hands with 16,000 bushels of golden corn, we are poorer by many dollars than we were years ago.
Between 1865 and 1890, Americans put more acres under the plow than they had in the previous 250 years. The nation's West was rapidly becoming the breadbasket of the world. But in the 1880s, prices dropped, the weather turned mean, and American agriculture went into a deep depression. As agricultural surpluses mounted, the price of grain and beef plummeted. Farmers already heavily in debt to bankers were forced to grow more and more to make less and less money. Unable to make payments on their loans, families lost their farms, packed up their belongings, and left their homes. Between 1882 and 1892, western Kansas lost half of its population. In South Dakota, Iowa, and Nebraska, families packed up their wagons and headed back east. Farmers blamed their troubles on manufacturers who were protected by federal tariffs that raised the price of foreign goods, railroads that charged exorbitant interest rates, and bankers who held their mounting debts.
There are three great crops raised in Nebraska. One is a crop of corn, one is a crop of freight rates, and one a crop of interest. One is produced by farmers who, by their sweat and toil, farm the land. The other two are produced by men who sit in their offices behind their bank counters and farm the farmers.
It is no longer a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but a government of Wall Street, by Wall Street, and for Wall Street. Mary Elizabeth Lease.
The federal courts consistently interpreted the Constitution to favor business.
The most common form of stopping strikes by government was the use of the injunctions, and we see hundreds and hundreds of injunctions issued by local judges at this point. It's the judiciary, it's judges who play the greatest role in stopping strikes.
The Democrats nominated a former populist named William Jennings Bryan for president. Bryan came from Nebraska. He was a very religious man, and he pretended to speak for farmers and workers, in other words, for ordinary people. He attacked what he called the malefactors of great wealth, rich people living in the East who he held responsible for the plight of farmers and workers.
To oppose him, the Republicans nominated Ohio Governor William McKinley.
McKinley didn't campaign much. In fact, McKinley sat on his front porch for the most part and let his front men and his advance men do most of his campaigning.
Bryan barnstormed the country, logging 18,000 miles by train in the nation's first whistle-stop campaign, and gave as many as 30 speeches a day. In speeches steeped in religious fervor, Bryan called on Americans to smite down the moneylenders and drive them from the halls of government. Bryan favored the free coinage of silver to deflate the value of the dollar and make it easier for farmers and others to pay off their debts.
having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the commercial interests, the laboring interests, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.
While Bryan's moral righteousness and biblical oratory scared off Catholic and ethnic voters, the Republicans released an unprecedented flood of pamphlets, posters, and press releases calling for ethnic and cultural toleration and a full dinner pail.
Bryan took the West and parts of the South, but McKinley proved a lot more popular among working people because he never really touched on the religious issue.
Winning the votes of the nation's urban and industrial working men, McKinley crushed Bryan in a lopsided victory. After the presidential election of 1896, the Populist Party faded away as returning prosperity pushed prices higher and U.S. farmers prospered. But the struggle between capital and labor continued.